The first part of Mueller's statement also can be interpreted to say he was justifying the whole purpose and the genesis of this Russia investigation in the first place. He talked about the investigation establishing that an arm of the Russian military and intelligence services of Russia had interfered in the election, had a hacking campaign, that there was a private Russian entity that had engaged in a social media influence campaign. And he said these matters needed to be investigated and understood. In a way, it felt like he was trying to justify why it was that the special counsel was appointed in the first place.
Absolutely. And I think he may be signaling that he feels that not enough attention was paid to that first section with all of the reports from the White House and the president, of course, specifically saying no collusion, that he wanted to emphasize that, as he said, every American should be concerned about this attack. He went into more detail than one might expect in this statement about that original indictment against the Russians a year ago, June. I also think it's very important to emphasize that he said, I hope and expect that this will be the only time that I speak to you in this manner. And he is saying that the report is his testimony. He's saying to the Congress, as you've noted, that he does not want to appear and that he will not go beyond the four corners of his report. And so it is now going to be conflicting pressure, of course. A lot of people in the Democratic Party in particular are going to be demanding that they force a subpoena, to force him to appear, to push this as far as they can. But others will say that this is an unnecessary piling on and that, in fact, he will not go beyond it. So it would just be the political spectacle that he has certainly signaled he does not want to participate in. I think it's very significant that he spoke so clearly about saying also that he did not find that the president did not commit a crime. He's just saying that they did not conclude anything because of those regulations and that practice, that the president cannot be indicted and it would be unfair to even have a sealed indictment, that the only reason to have the investigation, that there's plenty of reason to have the investigation to preserve the testimony while it is still fresh and to preserve the possibility of using it against co-conspirators. Savannah.
And he went one step further, Andrea, as you know. He said if we could have concluded and cleared him of a crime, we would have done so, but we didn't do that.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.